May I thank the organizers for the opportunity to be here and the learning over the last day, and I'm sure today also has been very significant, so I'm very happy I'm here for this meeting. What I'll be speaking about in the next 20 minutes will be in part, I think, complementary to what Dr. Mark Rosegrant has been speaking about. In part, I think also there are some points, if I may say so, of contestation. So I'll make that clear as we go along. So the question is, I think, there is a sort of divide in the subject which is not often recognized, that when you talk about the economic impacts of climate change, the question is, what is it that we should be studying? So of course, some basic issues are, let me just point them out very quickly. You look at impacts of climate change as a change from the baseline. It's important to remember that the baseline itself, over which, on top of which you have these further effects, is not a constant. It's a dynamic baseline, and we have been at various points throughout yesterday, the question of what is the baseline in terms of land use, various things has been constantly coming up. The thing is, for developing countries, this baseline is all of development. So it's not simply a baseline. It's not steady growth. It's not societies which have erased development deficits. So the baseline itself should be some kind of accelerated reach towards better well-being. And associated with that is not simply growth. It's also a whole lot of structural changes in economic and social order that are part of what you might call the baseline. So there is, a large literature and a huge debate in development economics about the extent to which development is modelable. So there are different classes of models in terms of models, or whether there are other ways of thinking about development. Human development, was one direction of thinking about development, which perhaps is not so amenable to modeling, and so on and so forth. So to continue on this issue is, how would you characterize development, which is in fact the baseline? So, then I would say that, macroeconomic issues, the large scale, a macro view of the economy are important. They are by no means insignificant, and, I won't go further into it. Mark has, covered it extensively, and, that's certainly necessary. But when it comes to, especially in the context of agriculture, the local is extremely important. The biophysical, the environmental, the economic and social aspects are very much part of the story. I think it's also very important, especially when you're talking about economics, to recognize that there is a fundamental normative issue here. Now, who is at the center of the story? So, people at the center of the story, is production at the center of the story. Is the previous speaker mentioned that agriculture is very important to India because 70% of the population is connected with it. There are a whole lot of people who do not think agriculture is so important because it contributes only 17% of GDP. So what is important? So there is a sense in which you have to make a normative choice in terms of what is your focus when you talk of development and transforming agriculture. And fundamentally, in terms of rural India, development is first and foremost the transformation of the structure of economic, social and political inequality. And this is fundamental. And human development is part of the story, it's one aspect of it. I don't think, however, it exhausts the entire content of what I just said about development as doing away with inequalities. So when we talk about climate change and development, this is not going to be a talk which is global. You will see from my emphasis that different regions have different things to focus upon. So high levels of inequality, so we are talking about India. So what is rural India characterized by? It is characterized by very high levels of inequality. There are rich and poor. The farmer is a term which is less than useful in socio-economic terms, I think, because farmers is a very heterogeneous category, and I will show more data to illustrate how exactly stark that heterogeneity is. So these inequalities in terms of land, assets, we are all familiar with the problems of social inequality. There is at least some awakening of, some conscience on the matter of gender inequality in rural India and even globally. Caste has thrust itself to the fore in various forms. So, and it is marked not only by inequality, associated with inequality is unequal access to natural resources, significantly water. So one cannot talk of water, I think, without talking of inequality. And you must remember, I think we too easily forget that at the center of the whole structure of untouchability, it was defined by physical touch. It was defined by who you could eat together with. It was also defined by your access to water in all its forms. So, so access to natural resources is a fundamentally socio-economic question, and it all adds up to the question of power relations in rural communities. So how do we go about studying this kind of scenario? So, official statistics are important and significant, but they are very insufficient, and especially in terms of probing some of the questions I've just raised have very significant gaps. They tend to underestimate inequalities significantly. And one way of doing this, which I have learned over the years from my colleagues, is by detailed village level surveys and information. So a lot of what I will say in just a little while depends on work which has been done by an organizer, a research outfit called the Foundation for Agrarian Studies. They used to be in Calcutta. Currently, they are located in Bangalore itself. And they have undertaken rather difficult, very detailed, time-consuming, in fact, village studies across 23 villages across several states of the country, covering a wide variety of agroeconomic zones and with a very detailed exploration of the socio-economic and production conditions of agriculture in these villages. So to talk about inequality of land, this is of course the official Gini. And in fact, the very first result from the survey, you will see in the footnote there that the Gini in ownership of land from the, no, that's official, that was 0.76. So, there is variation in this, so the Gini coefficient is increasing. But if you look at the village level studies of inequality in land holdings, the picture is actually very stark. Part of it has to do with the nature of official statistics on land ownership. The evasion of land reform regulations is the norm in rural India. And so if you need to actually probe at the village level. So you look at this enormous distinction, the bottom 50%, in no case, in none of the villages surveyed, crosses 18% of total agricultural land, whereas the top 5% typically, in some regions a little lower, but the top, there is more equal distribution. But in several cases, they own a very disproportionate share of the assets. And of course, in rural India, land is everything. So in terms of This is share in percentage. This is another data set assembled separately, same table. But if you take into account all assets, and this includes productive assets, and this includes machinery and things like that, it would include houses, value of houses, then this difference is incredible. So in all these villages survived, none of them, the bottom 50%, own no less than 10% of all assets. And the rest, is advantageous to be able to handle the market. It is also questions of power. When you buy from the pesticide dealer, the fertilizer dealer, the poor, buy on credit, which is very well known. So this whole set of problems eventually boils down to this set of differences. So if you go and, you can examine this actually in the case of particular villages. There are examples which I am not showing. You can show, there are studies about, these variation across, different crops. And this whole, this government work on agricultural costs and prices does not simply capture this phenomenon at all. So the other aspect is the absence of basic amenities. And if you look at the amenities, so so this is a list of in percentage of in the villages surveyed, the proportion of households that live in pakka houses with at least 2 rooms, with an electricity connection and access to a lavatory and a source of water within the house or at the doorstep, the minimum. So you see across Adivasis, Dalit and Muslims in the villages surveyed, the percentage is extremely low, but even all other castes together, the figure is only 22%. So this is this enormous human development habitat deficit of rural India. I do not have the figures here, but this whole, very often people think that the extent of inequality in rural India is less than Latin America, etc. This is a very popular thing to say. In fact, this is completely misplaced. What Indian official statistics always measure, as the experts know, is inequalities in consumption. Inequalities in income are much more difficult to pin down, to survey and to compute. And if you look at the inequalities in income, India is one of the most unequal places in the world. So, the difference between the inequalities in terms of consumption. Consumption, after all, will level off after a point. So what does all this imply for what has been the subject of discussion here? So the first point is, when you talk of conditions of production and correspondingly output and incomes, agriculture is not simply about, is not an experiment in biology. Agriculture happens because farmers earn livelihoods. The country has to be fed. Those who don't grow food have to buy food. Correspondingly, output in incomes vary sharply across socio-economic categories. Consequently, the consequences of climate or weather shock will be non-uniformly distributed across various categories of farmers, and in particular, any spatial averaging will often miss substantial aspects of inequalities and their consequences. It is not that it cannot be done, but you have to really need statistics of a much finer quality than we possess today in order to do both spatial averaging and this kind of socio-economic stratification. So climate shock needs to be studied seriously at the household or village level. So, you might say, after all, this is vulnerability. We know about all this. What are you talking about? So, I think the theoretical conceptions of vulnerability certainly are important and useful. There is a big literature on this. But most of these conceptions of vulnerability have a very general, diffuse, non-specific view of empowerment. and therefore miss a good part of the real story of why a particular region has a level of inequality. They miss out on local political and social hierarchy. And in fact, if you look when they try to quantify it, the vulnerability ranking is very sharply dependent on the shock which you define as part of the study. And so you have papers which have completely opposite rankings, in fact negatively correlated, and both of them have been cited in the fourth assessment report of the IPCC. So, that's like. And the relevance of the choice of indicators are rarely tested against actual outcomes of climate shocks. How much more time do I have? Not very much. Yeah. So let me speed up. So I think having looked at the sort of picture of rural India that I've been talking about, these village surveys, I think it is very useful and important to carry this technique forward to study actually the impact of cyclones, droughts, to study weather and climate shock at the village and household level. So for instance, we did a study, my student Harshan did a study of the impact of Cyclone Thane on one village in Tamil Nadu. So these are the general, it was quite extensive damage which was due to the cyclone. It slammed in when the paddy was ready to be harvested, so it did enormous damage. So we studied one village on the border of Pondicherry and the Kadalur district, and at the pattern of land holding, etc. is really a huge number of landless in that village. And so if you look at the income in the year prior to the cyclone, so you look at the net income per acre and gross income per acre, you really see the same pattern that I was talking about earlier. Okay, sharp differences across the entire strata. And then of course in the case of agricultural income in the year of the cyclone, it wiped out the main crop, the samba crop was wiped out. So the net income per acre, you look at the loss, it is negative. And some of the highest losses are the losses actually, so the loss is sort of, there are some outliers in between, but the loss has a much less, sort of skewed distribution. The more uniform distribution of loss than you have of the income in a normal year. So when you do well or you do okay, in an okay year or a good year, the better off farmer does much better. But in a bad year, the sort of, if you comparable way, if you look at it, the poorer farmers suffer, much more. Now, of course, you might, if you look at the gross value of damage, and this you have to be careful, obviously the richer farmer will suffer more gross value of damage. But this is like saying if there is an earthquake in Mumbai, and 1 lakh people lose their slum shanties, and God forbid, Mukesh Ambani's Antilla also keels over. The GDP loss, the asset value loss from both these will be comparable. But on the one hand, you have 100,000 households. On the other, you have exactly one. So, so the gross value of damage is a category which should be used carefully. So not only this kind of climate shock, I think we need to look at other forms of, climate extremes that are not really spikes of the kind that a cyclone is, for instance. And there I think the most interesting work is, I think, I am quite taken with the work of Lobel, etc. This goes to the same point that Dr. Sulochana Gadgil was making yesterday, that, it is not just the mean which is an important variable for output, productivity. I think the mean as well as variability are very important. So this is a striking result, and we have in our group at TISS, we have started looking at sort of variation in green season length, etc., for say 1999-2012. And you see that there are a few patches, Satara, Sangli district, for instance, in Maharashtra, other places where you have, substantial variation in green season length. So what this kind of analysis needs to be substantiated further with is analysis on the ground in terms of how it affects different sections of society. So I'll stop at this point. I'm already over time and I'm grateful to the chairperson. But I think that we need at the very least two complementary ways, at least, of talking about economic impacts of climate change. One is learning from current climate variability. Second is figuring out exactly what is the relationship between development and climate. And third, to have a healthy, shall we say, I wouldn't say disregard, a healthy skepticism towards purely top-down studies and supplementing them with detailed studies at the lowest of local levels and in the most disaggregated form, because that somehow captures, in these cases, the true picture of the economic impacts. Thank you.